I'm David Lombardo, and this is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're considering legislation that would expand the definition of a disaster declaration in New York to include human-made problems like hazardous air quality, and would add air quality emergency preparedness to the list of emergency management plans needed to be maintained here in the Empire State. For more on the issue, we're joined in the studio by Max Micallef, New York State Advocacy Manager on Clean Air Initiatives with the American Lung Association. So, Max, what is the practical significance of adding hazardous air quality to the list of criteria that could lead to a disaster declaration?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me. We need to go back to 2023 in June when we were experiencing the Canadian wildfires in New York State, where all New Yorkers across the state, Western, Capital Region, especially New York City, were affected. We saw an increase in emergency room visits, especially in New York City, of children and older adults, primarily in low-income communities, as well as Black and brown neighborhoods of people with pre-existing lung disease, asthma, COPD, because the Canadian wildfires exacerbated their symptoms, so they had to go to the ER. You know, I think the state government tried their best to address it, but because hazardous air quality was not a state definition of a disaster, the operations weren't there and the resource distribution really wasn't there. So what this bill does, the Hazardous Air Quality Emergency Preparedness Bill, is adding to the state definition of a disaster, hazardous air quality, so that when the executive office can declare a state of emergency, resources are released, including funding. So it would allow local municipalities to have the operations in place to address hazardous air quality emergencies, as well as resources like air ventilators, masks, and how to address certain things like if schools are not closed, how to maintain the health of our students, our youth, senior living facilities, things of that nature.
Well, is there something about the status quo that would prevent that sort of all hands on deck type of response that you just described?
Yeah, I think with the bill currently, there are some people, that say, well, we already have air contamination as a state definition of a disaster. But unfortunately, by law, that does not include wildfires and industrial emission spikes, because we see, let's say climate change fueled wildfires as a natural disaster. So that's not included in what we consider pollution in New York State. So by including hazardous air quality, it would include things like wildfires as well as industrial emission spikes, which happen in, the backyards of low-income communities daily.
So what would be the threshold then for constituting a hazardous air quality? And would there be a duration factor as well? Because I think we all remember how long those Canadian wildfires stretched on for. But what if something was maybe a shorter blip? Would that not necessarily rise to the extent of a disaster?
Yeah, so that would happen on a case-by-case basis, right? Because we don't want to treat Western New York the same as the Capital Region or New York City or Long Island. So we would be able to pull in, those community experts, the public health experts, the environmental justice experts in when this bill becomes law, hopefully, and, the middle stage between enacting the law and when the law goes into effect, pulling those experts at the table to determine, what those thresholds would be and make sure that it is directed by the local communities, the local municipalities, and their specific needs. So it's not treated as universal.
But is this something that has, say, objective measurement criteria, or is this a subjective type of disaster? And we will need, like you said, various experts to weigh in on the facts on the ground.
Yeah, I'm sure, that when you pull in, medical experts and, people who deal with disasters as their, full-time job, they're going to know exactly what their thresholds are. And, they would be brought to the table when this bill is enacted. And, but again, not treating each municipality as the same, because, the Long Island is going to have different wind patterns because they're surrounded by water, let's say. But then, Central New York is going to have a different experience. So it would definitely be on a case-by-case basis and make sure that we are able to address all of these case-by-case incidences equally.
And again, bringing up the Canadian wildfire experience, if you just looked into the sky, you knew something was wrong. But yeah. I imagine maybe not every hazardous air quality issue is going to present that way. So do we have monitoring or data collection in New York for something like this? I know that in the past we've talked with the Department of Environmental Conservation about some of their static and more active efforts. How do you imagine collecting the air quality data that might inform the decisions about when to declare a disaster?
Yeah, I think the great part of bills like this is it also ties into asking ourselves the hard questions of, are we even doing proper air quality monitoring along with this? I know
Do you think we are?
I think the DEC is working on it. I think we have some work definitely to do to expand air quality monitoring across New York State. So people can be more informed of, right now you can luckily, hopefully it is, I wouldn't say this is universal across New York State, but at least, me in Schenectady, I can Google Schenectady air quality and it shows, I don't know, maybe 2 monitoring, spots in the area that can detect air quality and see if I'm safe to go outside, or do I have to wear a mask, things like that. But I definitely think, if this bill becomes law, and is enacted, it would definitely strengthen our ability to do air quality monitoring. And I think that's also an area we need to work on.
Well, before we move on, let me reintroduce you. For listeners just joining us, I'm David Lombardo, and this is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're speaking with Max Micallef, New York State Advocacy Manager on Clean Air Initiatives with the American Lung Association. So I want to talk a little bit more about sort of the second component of this bill, the idea of air quality, emergency preparedness, and adding that to the list of emergency management plans that need to be maintained in the Empire State. Are you primarily interested in what sort of the state type of plan would be, or is this something where we want each county to have their own emergency response in an air quality disaster? And if it is something like a county response, what sort of capacity do you think they have to respond to something like this?
The best part of this bill, the most effective part of this bill, is that the state would be assisting in resources and operations, local municipalities, towns, counties, cities, in it would be a cross collaboration. So the local municipalities would be telling the state what they in their region specifically need, and the state would be there to assist in providing those resources and providing those operations. Because again, this isn't we want to treat, regardless of the region of the air quality emergency is happening, we want to treat it as universal, but at the same time, it's not going to be affecting the people the same, because we have different rates of, going back to the American Lung Association does an annual State of the Air report. This year, we're going to be releasing our State of the Air report in late April. Each region has different, rates of, let's say, pediatric asthma, or, people with COPD, lung cancer, things like that. So local municipalities would be telling the state what they need, and the state would be assisting in the process.
A few years ago, the state passed a green amendment of sorts that was added to our Constitution, and one of the components of this was guaranteeing a right to clean air. How do you factor something like this in with our ongoing conversation and what people should expect in terms of a disaster declaration? Because if someone is saying you have a right to clean air and the response is, hey, stay inside, I guess you could imagine people saying, well, that's not what the state government is supposed to do. You're supposed to, give me a filter or take mitigating action. I mean, how do you think about these two different components, your pending legislation and that constitutional amendment, and how they might interact with each other?
Yeah, words are words and actions are actions. I think, if we're going to say that clean air is a right, we need to actually put action into it to prove that. And this bill, for example, is one of these actions that prove that we are serious in New York State when we say clean air is a human right. And, making sure that we address disasters in a way where we uplift lung health, we uplift, because if you can't breathe, you have nothing else. That's one of American Lung Association's slogans. And, again, if we're going to say the rhetoric, we got to put action to it. And this bill does that. Right now in New York State, unfortunately, we're supposed to be climate leaders, and we're seeing a lot of climate law rollbacks. So I think we owe it to New Yorkers to pass the Hazardous Air Quality Emergency Preparedness Act bill.
Well, thinking about then New York's role or its place in the broader landscape for something like this, are other states doing something like this? Do other states have the framework for declaring a disaster when there is hazardous air quality? Do they have a more robust plan, or is this a case where you want New York to be a leader and maybe other states can follow what we're doing?
This is definitely a case where we want New York State to be a leader in roles of like hazardous air quality disaster preparedness, because in other states there's different wording in terms of their emergency declarations, but it is not the same path that this bill is taking. So we would definitely be setting an example on a national level of how people should be addressing wildfires and industrial emission spikes.
And what about something that maybe doesn't rise up to the level of a hazardous air quality situation that warrants a disaster declaration? What should the state be doing in those cases? And right now, do you think we do enough to respond to maybe more localized or short-term air quality issues when they arise?
Yeah, when we see, for example, again, going back to the Canadian wildfires, that was clear that was an emergency because you could look in the sky and it was orange, red, and you were coughing because of the fine particulate matter. But things that go overlooked is the industrial emission spikes in people's backyards, especially in urban areas that happen on a daily basis, and people's lung health is affected by that, and that goes overlooked and no one is held accountable. So this bill would add those type of measurements in place where if those industrial emission spikes occur, it can be properly recorded that, hey, this source committed a state definition of a disaster, and that can be handled appropriately and help people in the long term.
As you push this bill, I could imagine one perspective is, hey, we're glad to have the additional authority to act on something like this. But then I could also imagine pushback being, we don't want to have our hands tied. We don't want there to be expectations for what we have to do in this situation. And maybe we already feel like we have the authority. What sort of response are you getting as you push this, especially in the Assembly where this bill is stalled, or maybe even from the governor's office, which has not necessarily been out front pushing this type of issue?
Yeah, I think the, like you said, right now it's stalled in the Assembly, and a lot of the rhetoric coming forward is, we already have air contamination as a state definition of a disaster. And we just, us, our advocates, our health professionals are going to continue to do the pushback of, no, it does not cover, as we saw in 2023 with our lack of preparedness, it does not cover wildfires that are climate change induced. It does not cover industrial emission spikes. And, unfortunately, we could see, because of the lack of preparedness that happened in June of 2023, that this bill is desperately needed. And people need to prioritize that this is a public health issue, this is a environmental justice issue, and that the priority should be protecting people's lung health, protecting people who have pre-existing lung disease, and that should be the priority here rather than thinking about if it's an administrative burden or not, which is it is not an administrative burden. We already have multiple different definitions of a state disaster. This is actually a very simple bill. It's the text is, I think, less than 2 pages. It just adds to the state definition of what disaster is, and we already have operations in place for other state definitions of a disaster.
Well, we're going to have to leave things there. We've been speaking with Max Micallef. They're the New York State Advocacy Manager on Clean Air Initiatives for the American Lung Association. Max, thanks for visiting us in the studio.
Thank you very much.
Fraud and lawsuit abuse raise car insurance costs for New Yorkers. Reforms are being proposed to mitigate their impact, but some Albany leaders want to keep the status quo. Information on these reforms is available at keepnewyorkaffordable.org.